I think the people who worked at the Bee were very dedicated people. You know, I was unusual in the fact that I grew up through the ranks. I mean, you know, you generally don't have any generally an editor comes from outside. I came and you know and started at the Bee in 1982 in Sacramento and in 1998 I was named the editor. So, you know, so I was one of the old people, and so you didn't like neglect the old people.
No.
And so I was fortunate to have you, Peter Badia, help me. Bill Endicott, certainly. I mean, I was thinking of quitting the newspaper business altogether when Bill Endicott joined the Bee from the Los Angeles Times and took me under his wing in the Capitol Bureau. Again, no reason why. He and I argued quite a bit.
He threw a book at you
He
once.
threw a book at me,
And now he's one of your dearest friends.
he is one of my dearest friends, and yeah, well, that's because I did something he told me not to do, but I thought it was the right journalism decision, so we won't go into that sorry story. But you know, I really enjoyed working at the Bee. You know, in the end, as the transition came from the printed paper, I admit I was reticent, slow to embrace the new media, but there were reasons for that. You know, people think, oh, he was just clueless, and I saw it was coming, and that's why I thought I knew that we couldn't make the same kind of money that we did, that we were making for every dollar of newsprint money that we were making something like 15 to 18 cents online. That, you know, if anybody was good in math, they were going to see what was coming, that there's going to be massive staff cuts because we couldn't maintain the same kind of payroll that we had. I could see that there was going to be a decline in the influence because of all of the other voices that we're having. You know, Craigslist pretty much took away all of our income from classified advertisements, which was like a license to print money, and you could see all of that stuff coming. And so, did I resist going into online? Yeah, I did, and some of that was the fact that I didn't see it was going to come as fast as it did. But also, I was trying to slow down what I saw as inevitable, which was cutting down the influence of the Bee, cutting down the impact of the Bee, cutting down and having to lay off, you know, all kinds of people. At peak, we had, I think it was 295 in the newsroom and another I don't know 15 or 16 in the editorial board, which I wasn't in charge of. But you could see that was gonna go away, and we had just done really good work. When I left the Bee, we had just won the Pulitzer for photography. We had won just about many of the major awards in journalism. We're clicking in Elk Grove. Our readership surveys were showing great readership and great diversity in the readership. One of the proud things that I saw is when we had readership surveys, our readership was almost equal among Latinos, white, black, Asian Americans, almost level the readership among the population. And so it was like we were serving an entire community. And that was what you taught me. It was, is that you had to care about the community and you had to try to serve the community, and that you had to understand what the community values were. And I also thought it was really important to build a community and not to isolate Latino coverage or isolate African American coverage, but to integrate all of that to really reflect Sacramento, which, as many of us know, was named as the most integrated, diverse city in America. And I said, okay, the paper needs to reflect that. And so we tried to do that, but in the end, it became survival, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and you weren't the only one, obviously. The industry as a whole didn't understand what was coming with the internet. and we gave our stuff away.
Yep.
We thought the initial, with a few exceptions, like the New York Times, and we thought we could give it away to Google and all the aggregators, and they could put it together, and we would make it on advertising. So we didn't put any paywalls in there. So when you give it away for year after year after year, and then all of a sudden you say, "Oh gosh, we got to start getting paid for this," then there's that real resistance from
Yep.
people.
Well, that was one of the few
Because you're
things
giving it to me.
that was one of the few things I did early. Is I said that we needed to make people pay for the content online, and people disagreed with me. But I remember making that argument, and we did try to make our political content paid for, but it didn't work because everybody else was giving it away for free.
I mean, the New York Times has 5 million people online now. I remember
Yep.
at an early ASNE meeting, it was either late 90s or the early 2000s, and young Schultzberger stood up before
Yep.
us and held an Apple
Tablet. Yeah.
tablet and said, "This is where you're going to be delivering newspapers." And he said, the New York Times has identified 10 million people across the globe who we see as New York Times readers, and our goal is to get every one of them, well, however we get them.
Yeah.
And by God, they've gotten
a lot.
They've gotten, counting print, probably 6 million of them right now. And
Many of them not in New York.
they have more digital subscribers, I understand, in California than they do in New York. So they understood. The USA Today, talk about coming late to the table, last week announced they were putting up a paywall. And they had this great digital operation at the USA Today.
Yeah,
they were ahead of many of us.
Many of us.
Because Gannett was ahead of many of us. But they just now, in 2021, they put up a paywall.
But still, even then, I mean, I do think that even we didn't recognize that coming, we still had oversized influence in the community. I think.
There's no question. That's one of the things that brought me here. The editorial page was so strong. It was the strongest editorial page in the state of California.
Yep.
In my mind, it was. Now, some people might argue with that, maybe the LA Times, but I think it was much stronger than the LA Times, and they had more influence because the people at 10th and they all read it every day.
Yep.
And that had great influence.
And the other thing is that both of us came from different backgrounds where we were really committed to writing about issues in the community and issues of the underdog, and it reflected our personalities. When you're an editor, you essentially, what's your background? You guys heard what my background was. It's much different, and so did I put more emphasis on covering issues to which I could relate to? Yes, I did. And I deployed resources that way. You did the same thing.
Well, I grew up in a family with a father and a mother who thought that, everybody deserved respect in the state of Mississippi. And my dad was way ahead of his time, both as a politician and as a newspaper owner. And I just grew up in a different atmosphere than many other people in Bay St. Louis, Mississippi, or in any place in the state of Mississippi. And unfortunately, it hasn't changed a great deal.
Yeah.
It changed some, thank goodness, because of the Voting Rights, the then Voting Rights Act of 1965, which has been chipped away, well, actually axed away in recent years. But my dad was a different kind of politician. And he taught me that, also that if you persevere, you can succeed, and that you never give up. So I grew up in a much different kind of way. My dad was I grew up in a Catholic family, went to Catholic schools for 12 years, and it was much kind of just a different environment than most people in Mississippi. But I agree that you have to have an affection for the community in which you serve. Mm-hmm. That doesn't mean you bend over.
That's right.
And you don't look at the bad things.
That's right.
And because everything's not good.
That's true.
And you call out the bad and you write about the good as well. Steve Maganini was our diversity writer. Steve Maganini was selected by Columbia University time after time as the best diversity writer in the United States.
Yep.
And he covered all the communities equally. And he wouldn't write a thing about them until he had been immersed himself in the community for about 6 months, meeting people and talking to people and getting to know the community. That's the way you have to do. You can't parachute in, and we do too much parachute journalism where you just parachute in and
I'm teaching
and
that.
you write like,
I teach that now.
Yeah,
You parachute into a country. Yeah.
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 But because you teach it now, and you're
Yeah.
teaching folks how to cover
Yeah.
people that don't look like them.
That's right. Panama. This year we'll probably go down to Guatemala, maybe. But we were also fortunate that even though we built staffs of people who weren't exactly like, I was really fortunate to, one of the hardest decisions to do is choose a managing editor. I chose a great managing editor, Joyce Terhart. And Joyce was very different than my background. Minnesota. So I used to call it Minnesota. And but she was a terrific partner in terms of setting goals and bringing me, off the wall as when I would go off on one of my tirades. But we had great people. Great people surrounding us, a diverse people. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to listen to what folks had to say, and then but in the end, I'd make the decision. Now when I'm teaching at ASU, Arizona State University, Walter Cronkite School of Journalism, I still live in Sacramento. I commute back and forth. But when I end up doing that, I've had a couple of students, lose it and start screaming at me in the middle of the newsroom there, and other students would walk up and say, how did you let that go on? And there's limits, but I would say they're very passionate about their stories. This is about stories. This wasn't personal. They were very passionate. Let them have their say, and in the end, I'm going to listen, and in the end, I'm the one that's going to decide. And that was something that you taught me, as you said, in the end, you're going to make the decision. So,
and you make
the wrong ones.
But I remember when Richard Allen Davis, this scumbag who
gave the finger,
killed a young woman, kidnapped a child, raped her and killed her, and then he was finally caught and then went to trial, was convicted, and then he turned around after the jury gave the decision, a death penalty, when he got the death penalty, and he turned around and gave the finger to the family of this child, and it was a picture that ran everywhere, all across the country. I decided not to run it.
I remember.
And people said, well, why didn't you run that picture? I said, I wasn't going to give that guy one more bite of the apple. These people were grieving so much, and they're going to run this picture. I said, you don't need that picture to show what kind of human being he was. You could argue, and with some of my best friends in the business ran that picture, but there was a picture I ran that I wish I hadn't run. That's when the Challenger exploded, and Christy McCauley was killed, the young teacher, along with 4 other people. And they snapped a picture of her mother and father at that moment, and we ran it on page 1. And I woke up the next morning and I realized I'd made a mistake. They deserved a moment of privacy.
They did.
It was a great picture. It was a news picture that, but one they were having in one of the foreign countries where I can't remember exactly which one, where the white soldier was being dragged through the street by black citizens in that country.
Somalia.
And we were in the middle. You remember
I remember. We
had the NAACP and several other businesses that had been bombed, pipe bombs, and I decided not to run it because I thought it would exacerbate what was going on in this community at that time. You can argue again that I made a mistake, but I don't believe I did. I think one of the things that you talked earlier about loyalty, the other value that we shared was an ethical value that you do what you think is right, and you hope that the next morning when the first caller calls, you can defend that decision.
That's it.
And there were a few times I couldn't defend that decision. I made mistakes, but most of the time I could defend that decision.
Yeah, I remember that. But nowadays the editors now don't have really that luxury. You really have to have some guts not to run that when all your competition is
Yeah.
running it online and it's instantaneous. So the
But
whole measure of what you had to do, we had the benefit, even making mistakes like I did. I still had the benefit of, maybe a 12-hour news cycle to decide. Now the decisions have to be made
it's
instantaneous,
it is
and,
harder,
and it's harder.
but values are still there. Your
The
basic
values are there, and
values.
that's what I'm teaching. I teach ethics at Arizona State in addition to foreign reporting and a seminar on border issues. So much of what I grew up doing, but also the ethical values, because I think even though the ethics are changing constantly, there are certain core values that are really worth keeping. For me, you talk about legacy. I'm hoping that some of those students will remember stuff that I taught them in that class, as well as the classes I teach them when I take them out to the field and teach them how to
They
report.
will. I left 2 jobs over principle and values, and I believe sincerely that there's no job worth keeping if you're going to surrender your values. There's no job. I don't care what it is, whether it's President of the United States or picking up garbage. If you have to surrender your values, why,
Yeah, and hopefully you don't. But even that, you called it King's Arena. Now everything's got a name. Arco Arena. At the Cronkite Journalism School, they sell classroom names. We have I don't remember, but there are corporate classroom names. The theater is named. And that's how you raise money now.
See, I wouldn't mind. I don't mind if somebody puts up the money to help build the arena. I think they've earned a name.
Okay.
Then. If they put up if Arco had put up millions to help build that arena, I would have named it Arco Arena. That's not the case. All they did was buy a name.
Yeah.
A young man in town built that arena
Yeah.
with his own.
Yeah, at that time.
And
yeah.
why should it become Arco? Because they gave
I'm
some
just
money.
saying. I'm just saying now everything's pretty much all the stuff.
I understand that. You have resisting that is much more difficult today
It is.
than it used to be.
It is
I understand that.
because you're in survival mode. I mean,
Maybe that's why you and I were in the golden age of
we
newspapers.
were.
And didn't have to worry about
We
all
were
that stuff.
we were.
And then we
fortunate.
worked for a guy like C.K. McClatchy,
We did.
who protected us all those years.
We did.
And I had the great privilege of working for several other people like that as well. In Chicago, Marshall Field, who was really in the background, except in the community. He was very, very prominent, young Marshall Field. And, we did stories that were really difficult for him, including exposing the cardinal of the Catholic Church in Chicago about stealing millions of dollars and giving it to a woman with whom he'd had a child. For many years, he'd been living with this woman. I had her, not lived with her, but had an affair with her. And that a city of 4.2 million Catholics. That was a tough decision for him to make. And he never hesitated because it took us 2.5 years to get that story.
The right.
But every piece of that information was verified.
Well, those are the values. Those are the values we're supposed to teach. I mean, we're in this era of fake news and stuff like that, and we abide. I mean, we had issues at the Bee. We fired very prominent people for plagiarism and fabrication and conflicts of interest and those aren't easy decisions, but those were our values at the time. And hopefully they'll continue to be values. But I think as journalism is evolving, people are doing things now that we would have looked back just 15 years ago and said, we ain't gonna do those things. Those things aren't the things that we do. But there's so much pressure. There's so many voices, and that circles back to what the Bee is. What's the influence? What's the influence going to be in the future? I mean, 21st and Q. That's all we used to call it. Now 21st and Q is empty. It's going to go. The people working at the Bee are still trying. They're doing good stuff, but they're down to they've been cut by 80%. And I admire those folks who are still working and still, trying to hold on to our values and keeping
Yeah,
them
many of them we
vivos.
brought here.
Yeah, well, there are not that many left
That's
anymore.
But, a lot of good ones still there.
Yeah, there's still good ones, and
Yeah.
and they're trying, and I really admire that. But it's a different era. I mean, we were lucky to my friend.
Yeah,
to
when
live
I
in that
when I
golden
came
era.
here, as I did every place I went, I probably had lunch every day with somebody from the community
Yeah,
because I didn't know Sacramento.
yeah,
And
I
so
remember.
I wanted to learn.
You lived at the Holiday Inn for a long
And
time.
then CK and I went around and had these open forums
Yep.
for people so they could yell at us or ask us questions or whatever
Did
they
the
wanted
same
to do. And as you know, that was hard for CK to do because he was such
so
an
shy.
introvert and so shy, but he was great at it. He really was good at it.
Yep. Give him a
But you
stage.
got to know your community.
You did.
And now we have people who come in and they go on, and we don't have a lot of people who, the institutional knowledge and the knowledge of the community is much slimmer than it used to be because of that. And unfortunately, and not just at the Bee, it's across the country, absolutely across the country.
But that institutional knowledge was the benefit of keeping the old timers who came in, and then you meld them with the youngs, and there was that atmosphere that we would have folks who had been there for 20 and 30 years who would tell you what the background was in City Hall and all of that stuff. And unfortunately, we don't have that same kind of depth in the benches anymore. And it's not only the Bee; it's all over the country.
Well, you had 28 years at McClatchy?
I had 28 years at McClatchy.
And I had right at 18, so
Yeah.
you had 10 years more than I
Yeah,
did
yeah,
at McClatchy.
yeah. Three in Fresno and 25 in Sacramento. And so it was.
I mean, I remember the first week I was here, not the first week, but the third week I was here, I went in and see Bob Byler, who was the general manager then, and I was redesigning the paper because when I came here, it was almost nothing but full-page ads in the A section, and things ran all over the paper. You couldn't find anything that was the same day in the
I
same
remember that.
place. So I said, Bob, I'm redesigning, creating a couple of new sections. And I said, it's going to cost about $250,000 more in newsprint. Is that okay? And he said, okay. And I thought, wow.
Well, you can do those things. We're so
Couldn't do
fortunate.
that today.
No, it's
you
fortunate.
just
I
can't
mean,
do
one
it.
of the things when I left the Bee and I left, it was kind of a shock. It was very sudden. And when I did my speech in the newsroom as I was leaving, and I was just heartened because people, as I was walking out the door, they lined up to shake my hand and everything, and that was really touching. But I remember one of the things that I never did enough as an editor is tell the people who worked for me, thank you.
Tell people,
Thank you for all of that work you did, those hours that you spent away from your
I-
children, your families, working fires, all of that stuff.
of course, that's why I created, when we was here, every year I had this little slush fund
Yeah,
in the budget where I would buy like $30,000 worth of
yeah.
Macy's coupons.
I helped you do that.
Cake.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, and we passed them
And
out.
every time somebody did something well,
Yep.
I believe that you write praise and you speak criticism. I've always operated on that basis. If you write praise, people keep it. And I'm talking about write it the old-fashioned way. You could write praise and speak criticism, because if you write criticism, unless you have to do it for legal reasons, it will never go away, especially if it's on the internet.
Yeah.
Uh,
Well,
if you send people a note on the internet,
Yeah.
that's critical. Bingo, you
Yeah, do
lost
that.
them. And you can't do that.
yeah.
But I literally have people come up to me years later and pull out their wallet and say, you remember this note you sent me?
Yeah. Yeah.
I have a telegram
Yeah.
that is framed in my bookcase that I got in 1958. It was the second Daytona 500, and I was assistant sports at Atlanta Journal. But I occasionally would cover automobile racing because I like to go down to Daytona and see the race. And that was Lee Petty, was the great champion then. He was the father of Richard Petty. And Lee had an accident and went through the wall at Daytona Speedway, the almost new one-year-old Daytona Speedway. And he was seriously injured. And he was in the hospital in Daytona being operated on. Well, I found my race story. I was an afternoon newspaper in Atlanta. So I found my story on the race, and then I went to the hospital, and I sat with his wife and his two sons, Richard and then his younger son. I sat with them all night, and while they were operating on him, and I wrote a story. I could write it for the morning, for the afternoon paper, because I could get it there by 7 o'clock in the morning. And so I wrote a story and sent it. And Furman Bishop, who was my boss, who didn't give out many compliments, sent me a telegram thanking me and some other very kind words about that story. And I thought it made such an impression on this young 22-year-old kid. I not only kept it by myself, but I realized how much that kind of care and feeding of the people who work for you, how much it meant to me, how much it meant to other people as well.
And then time passes by so quickly, and you figure out, okay, did you do it enough? And I concluded I didn't, but.
And also walking around the newsroom talking to people, and not talking about work, but talking about how, and understanding whether or not they have issues in that they're dealing with in their lives, and it's all part of being.
But it's difficult. Journalists are some of the most interesting, dynamic, well-informed, insecure, difficult to manage people that you'll ever find. It's a place like nothing else. The good ones, the good ones. They're wonderful. I enjoyed working with the people at the Bee immensely, but some of them were difficult, man.
I worked with the great Mike Royko in Chicago, and Roger Ebert, the great film critic, and Roger was one of the easiest people in the world to work with, the easiest person, the editor I ever knew.
I remember meeting him with you. Yeah.
I had the opportunity to edit Dear Ann for a few days because the regular editor was off, and she worked up the floor above me. Her place was, and Eppie, who was a dear friend, she called me. I edited the first column I had with her, and she called me, and I thought, oh God, she's going to yell at me. And she said, "You were not hard enough on me." And I thought, wow. Here's Dan Landis, after all these years of, it's thousands of newspapers around the world run her stuff, and then she writes, she still values it enough to say, hey, you weren't hard enough on me.
No, those days, those memories are great. And I think having, grown up really, I grew up in the newsroom pretty much and watching history unfold, and
well, both of us did.
We did. And I feel privileged to have seen that and being part of that, and all of the people that we met, like you said, I mean, some of them were difficult, some of them didn't get their time.
Well, my hope and my prayer is that the Bee will survive.
Yep.
I worry about the new owners because this is the first time it's been outside of the family.
Yep.
And the family went through 5 generations, and it's a history of our business. All the great families, with a few exceptions, are no longer in the business. And it was a family business for many, many years. Hearst is still there, and the New York Times family is still there. But even the great family, the Graham family, is no longer there at the Post, even though they have the richest man in the world who owns them. But that's which is a blessing.
Still doing good work.
They're doing great work, and it was a blessing. And our friend was the editor of that. But I hope that the Bee can survive, whatever it is, whether it's as a digital only, or at least for a few more years, print and digital, which I don't believe it will be. But some fashion, because it has meant so much to this community. And the family, legacy of this family is, I was thinking of this the other day, that generation of C.K. McClatchy and Dean Shaber and, Gene Runyon, and there was people that grew up right in that era. That generation, there's like a dozen or so people in just Sacramento.
Yep.
And that's what it made Sacramento in the long run. That's what made it is. This is a city of trees. Why? Because the McClatchy family years ago would run a 3-inch story every time a tree died in the city and replace it with the tree foundation. So we became a city of trees. theater is big in the city because the owner McClatchy put up her money to make sure, because that was her love. She wanted to be she was in New York to be a writer, well, but when her father died, she had to come back and run the newspaper company. So, the McClatchy family is part of the roots of this community, and God, I hope the Bee survives.
I do too. I mean, obviously things have changed. The influence, I'm not sure will ever be the same as it did.
No.
But it had such a role in creating the region and the history of the region, and for me it was really, I was honored to have played a role in
I
keeping
made the
that
right choice.
family legacy going.
You made the right choice to stay here, and I didn't know about the New York Times offer, by the way.
Okay.
You didn't use it.
No, I didn't. No, actually, it was funny too, because when she retired, Carolyn Lee, she retired at one of the New York Times at the convention, and Diane McFarland says, "Well, why don't you come with me? She's going to do a retirement party. Carolyn's always talking nice about you." So I go there, and she's making a retirement speech, and she sees me out in the audience, and she points at me, and she says, "And there's always one that gets away." And because she was a New York Times recruiter, and so I was kind of honored that.
I remember you had an offer from the Boston Globe.
Yeah, the Boston
and
Globe,
I took
New
you to
York
lunch.
Times.
So you would.
Yeah, that was to be the
damn fool to think about
Mexico City. I'm going to get my foreign correspondent dream. I had love-hate relationship with Caesar. He would sometimes, like Gregory, he would write me a note, sign it. He didn't handwrite it, but he would type it out and he'd sign it and start it. If he liked the story I did, it would start off with "Dear Brother Rodriguez," and then if he didn't like it, he would send one of his spokespeople to call me up, and or the next time I would see him, he would shake your hand and give you the limp handshake. If he didn't give you a firm handshake, it means he didn't like you. So he would give me the limp handshake. But then the next time I met him, I was one of the few reporters that he ever invited inside his house, and his wife Helen, who I did not know very well, I just met her a couple of times, and she saw me inside the house, and she said, "Caesar, you know what the rules are." And Caesar says, "Okay, the boss has spoken. You gotta leave my house." And so we went outside and continued talking outside, but she threw me out of her house.
Because you were a reporter.
Because a reporter, and but she didn't like, that was the family space, and it was really interesting is that when Caesar died, I was already assistant managing editor, and I was in Las Vegas on vacation, and Peter Bhatia, the managing editor, calls me up and says, "We want you to do a column on Caesar." And I said, "Okay." And so I just got a napkin, I didn't have a laptop, and I just jotted it down, dictated it, and then a few days later I get a call from a guy who's turned out to be a friend, Mark Grossman, who was Caesar's spokesman for his whole life pretty much, and lives in Sacramento now, and we still get together every now and then. I have a lecture in my class. But Mark said, "Hey, the family would like you to come down and cover Caesar's funeral." And I said, "No, I'm not, reporters do that now, I'm editor." So they said, "Okay." And so about 2 days later, he calls again and says, "No, the family really wants you to come. The son, they want you to come. You knew him better than anybody. State Capitol wants you to do that." And so I go down there, and I get down there, and I'm talking to everybody, and everybody was, giving them condolences, and Caesar's lying in state at 40 acres, which is in Delano. It was their hiring home, and that's where most of it started. And he's lying in state, and they said, "Go in there," and they said, "Go in there and make peace with Caesar." And so there I was. I mean, I'm there. They had the honor guard me and Caesar. I mean, I'm like in a dark thing, and there he's sitting there, and I'm in there for like 20 minutes and thinking, this is really different and strange, but honored too that the family let me go in there and talk to him, because I'd covered him all of these years, and it was a real fascinating period of time. I mean, to go out there and see people and strikers understand that this was not just a labor issue; it was a civil rights issue. And I had a funny story with Jerry Brown. So Jerry Brown just passed 1975. I'm still going to Stanford, but I'm home on summer vacation, and he had just passed his Agricultural Labor Relations Act, giving bargaining to farm workers, union bargaining. And so they call up and they called the paper and said, hey, we have time for an interview. You can ride from the Salinas airport, tiny little airport, to Hartnell College, and you can interview the governor, whoever you assign. So they assigned me to do it. And I get all dressed up. I had a little, it was raining kind of, and so I had a little trench coat on. I had my little tie, and I sat up all night reading about all the things that had happened as much as I could, and had my notebook out, and my mom's taking my picture as I'm getting in the car with Jerry Brown and everything. And so I start firing away, Governor, da 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 da. He looks at me and he goes, shut up, kid, I'll tell you when you can talk. I had written a story in the class, and the teacher had a stroke, and the teacher has a stroke, and they kept changing teachers, and Stanford's on a quarter system, so it's like 12 weeks, and I had 5 teachers in 12 weeks, and so nobody would tell you the same thing. So at the end of it, there was this person who was a writer at the Chicago Tribune, I think, a magazine, who was teaching the course, and she was a Knight Fellow. And she calls me in and she says, I just read your story and let me give you some advice. She says, you need to quit journalism. He says, you'll never make a dime in journalism. She says, I'll pass you, but you're never going to make a dime in journalism. You're really bad.
She was from Chicago?
She was from Chicago.
You told me that story before, I can't remember.
Yeah, so fast
You
forward.
remember her name?
Yeah, but I'm not going to say it on the
Okay.
thing. But she passed away. Fast forward, now president of American Society of Newspaper Editors, editor of the Bee, and I'm part of a panel at a Knight Fellow reunion, and I had already told the curator of the Knight Fellow the story, and I said, hey, by the way, is she here? And he goes, yeah, after I finished my panel, and she says, yeah, in fact, she's walking at you right now. And I said, she goes, hi, and I said, and I cut her off. I said, did you teach magazine writing at Stanford in 1976? And she said, yeah, as a matter of fact, I did. She said, were you in that class? I said, yes. And she said, what'd you write about? And I said, I really don't remember the story, but I remember you telling me that I would never make a dime in journalism, that I should quit. And she goes, I couldn't have said that. And then she thinks, and she goes, oh, I remember. She says, I'm so sorry. And I said, don't be sorry, because I've used that as motivation for part of my whole career. As always, you never make a dime, you never make a dime. And I said, so, it kind of fired me up and made me look at myself, and, and that became part of my driving force. And I said, but I'm sorry, I cut you off. I said, what did you want to talk to me about? She says, I liked your speech so much that I was coming to ask you for a job. I mean, you want to talk about karma, man. I was just sitting there saying, it goes around. But things like that happened, and when I was covering Caesar, I went to Fresno from Salinas, and in Fresno, I had great editors, and they were nice, and I think they were trying to look out for me. And one of the editors came up to me and says, I understand you're thinking about covering Cesar Chavez and the United Farm Workers here. He says, this is a big ag area. And I said, yeah. So I covered him in Salinas. And then he goes, well, can you cover it objectively? And I said, why? And I said, I have. And he said, but you're Mexican and he's Mexican. And I said, and I'm 24, 25 years old, first week on the job, boss. And as Gregory said, I have a big mouth. And I said, can you cover Dan Whitehurst, the mayor, objectively? He goes, well, what do you mean? I said, well, you're white and he's white. And boom, end of conversation. He apologizes. We end up becoming good friends. But, I was a glass ceiling breaker for a lot of things. First Latino, editor of only Latino editor of the Bee. One of the few Latino editors of a major paper. At the time I was there, I was the only one that when Gregory helped me get that job. And one of the few. There was only one other Latino covering politics in the Sacramento before me, Manny Valencia. And there, it was hard going through those steps. But now I look and I'm proud at the diversity that we built and at the diversity that's starting to take hold across the country. And I think it's got to. I mean, if journalism's to survive, that we've got to understand different points of view and give opportunities, even if they don't agree with me. I think one of the things you have to do is you have to have diversity of thought. Now, I'm not a big fan of fake news, but I am a fan of letting people have their marketplace of ideas and being able to debate them. But hopefully we're getting past, and we're going to have a much more diverse news ecosystem in the future.
Yeah, you talk about, they all of us have had great mentors.
Yeah,
and
I've had great
along the way
mentors.
I came-
You, Bill,
And some of my
Peter.
mentors are people who work for me, as opposed, because I think you hear, if you listen, you learn a lot from people. When I was a young kid, one of the motivations I got, one of my heroes was Turner Catledge. Turner Catledge was
New York
from New
Times.
Orleans, where I was born, but I grew up in Mississippi. My mom just went to the hospital, but I have a New Orleans birth certificate. And Turner went to work as a young man in Philadelphia, Mississippi, at a weekly newspaper. And he came to, when he was executive editor, he was managing editor at the time of the New York Times, when he came down to Biloxi to make a speech. And that's when he said, he said, I was on my way down, I was reading the Sunday New York Times. He said it was 222 pages, and we printed a little over 1 million copies. And he said, I tried to figure out how long it would take to print that edition of the New York Times on the old 2-page flatbed press, hand-fed, which we had at Almus. I learned how to do it. 2-page hand-fed press. In that number of papers, how long it would take to run that one edition of the New York Times in Philadelphia. He said, I did all the math. He said, I think I'm right. I think it would take, if you ran 24 hours a day for 24 years, we could print that one edition of the New York Times. He said, I guess I've come a long way.
Yes.
And I thought, I ran a 2-page flatbed press.
Yeah, you did. You came a long way.
And you could do that.
You went a long way.
I was a kid. You can do that if you
went a long way.
if you work hard enough and if you dedicate yourself.
You went a long way.
So,
yeah. No, we were fortunate. I mean, you got to see the transitions from the 2 press to the computers to the internet.
I don't quite go back to scripturia, but I'm pretty far back.
I know. Gregory did not use a computer when he was editor of the Bee.
I hadn't had enough time typing on. The first computer paper, I told you, I was the editor of the first computerized paper. The computer machines were in a room that was larger than this IBM machine.
Yeah, they were huge.
And we typed on IBM Selectrics. We had to type all of our stories on IBM Selectrics, and we ran them through the computers. They came out in paper type. Came out in ticker tape.
Ticker tape.
And then we had to run them through to get paper type.
Yep.
Because we were the only second offset newspaper in the country. The first was the Sacramento Union. The first offset newspaper in the country was the Sacramento Union, which we had the pleasure of saying grace over.
He was so competitive with the Union, man. He did stuff like when they had Wingo, they had the Wingo games, and used to buy the paper and see what your Wingo number was, and then he would go send somebody out to get the first edition and then print the Sacramento Union's Wingo numbers in the Bee.
So you didn't have to buy
the days of competition.
And they sued us.
They sued us.
Because they spent $500,000 on that, and it didn't do them any good because we printed the numbers.
We had some fun, but
Yeah.
But anyways, I hope I like I said, I agree with you. I hope the legacy lives on, and that the future is bright. I'm worried. I'm worried about where the Bee stands right now,
Yeah.
but good luck.
Don't worry about newspapers
Well, I worry about the
all
community.
together being owned.
I worry about the community if you don't
I
have
mean,
any
you got
watchdogs.
Gannett and Gatehouse now own almost 300 newspapers. Alden,
Yeah,
hedge fund Alden has God knows how many large newspapers. The hedge fund that owns Sacramento now has a bunch of newspapers. And all these hedge funds are buying
Yes, you can't do it. I mean,
newspapers and they drain them
I got interviewed to
and
be
then they flip them.
got interviewed to be editor about this was probably about 9 years ago, to be editor of a paper that I thought was going to be one paper, and they said, "Oh, you're going to be the editor of 32 papers." And I said, and then we're going to cut the staff and all the way down. And I said, "Well, how many staff are you going to have?" And they said, "Well, you probably have about 100 for 32 papers." And I said, "How are you going to do that?" And so, how are you going to cover a community? And so we didn't go too far. But those days of the golden days of the era that we were in, we were fortunate.
Yeah.
Allows us to tell great stories.
Yeah.